Amazing. Thanks a lot, everyone, for your time. Really excited about today's conversation. All of us at the Rivers 2050 Vision team are so happy to have Sophie join us today. We think that it's a very good way to sort of like close our public consultation series. We've, in the past 15 months, been able to engage quite a number of international partners, folks from Singapore and Qatar, and I feel like we saved the best for last. Having Sophie come share some of the wonderful lessons that she's learned from her work in Wales. Okay, so just as a quick run through for those who might not know about the Rivers 2050 vision. So Rivers State is one of Nigeria's 36 states. And the reason why we're starting this, or we started this project last year is because Rivers State hasn't had a long-term vision or plan for 50 years. The last time we had one kind of long-term governance framework was about 5 decades ago when we had our first governor, who funny enough was in his 20s. And we had a youth governor who had quite a bit of vision. And since then, the state has gone, like round and round in circles and quite a lot of short-term thinking and quite a bit of political turmoil as well. And so that's what brought us together last year, a group of young people, over 150 of us now, came together and said, let's do something about this. And one of the first things that we did was to launch a survey to get insights from citizens to ensure that the voices of citizens basically shape what the vision for the state should be. We've also been hosting since last year as well, focus group conversations, key informant interviews just like this with various experts across 15 thematic areas that we identified. All of that is now coming together into the Rivers 2050 Vision book, which will be launched in November. And we're really happy and excited to be able to include as many insights as possible. Quite a bit of people have also asked us about like where the vision book sits in sort of how we're thinking about the implementation of this project. And I mean, we're happy to have Sophie here, who has quite a bit of experience with the Well-Being of Future Generations Act, because we're also planning to do one. The way we see it is that the vision book is sort of like the role that citizens have played in bringing this vision to light, hopefully quickening up the state and making us wake up from an era of lack of planning and visioning. And then we hope that this will then inspire the executive. Of course, engagements are currently ongoing with the state governor and his cabinet to see that the state then comes up with development strategies that fit into the long-term vision. So breaking it into the 5-year cycle. Some good examples of this come from like Qatar or China, who are now in their 15th 5-year plan. And then hopefully that then sets the tone for the civil service and how we plan our annual budgets. Currently, our budgets come out of thin air. It doesn't like connect to anything. You just say like 7 billion for education. Why? On that framework. So we hope that this then helps to create some bit of like, congruity across the various planning cycles. And then all of these will then fit into the Well-Being of Future Generations Act, which we've been able to get, I'll say, a bit of like a green light from the state parliament. Post elections, this would be our next work, ensuring that there's a bit of institution and framework that would house all of the work that we've put in over the past 2 years. Yeah, I mean, we're also hoping that one of the landmarks for this project will also be what we call the Future Square. We hope it would be a place for innovation and learning, but also a place that sort of like promotes the act of long-term thinking and foresight and futures in everyday life as well, so that people in River State and also across Nigeria will be able to come there as a hub for futures and foresight. But we're also not very stuck on just building monuments. We're very aware of the challenges, the real challenges that River State faces, one of which is the biggest, I think, with 4.4 million people in multidimensional poverty. We think that's a huge thing. So much more than building monuments, we hope that the vision itself will help to shape the lives of people. We have found what to say, like the emergency areas that we think the state government needs to work on, and we call them the 4 E's, which is education, employment, energy, and economic diversification. And these are like some of the areas that we've seen from our survey of close to 5,000 citizens as the burning areas that people really need urgent intervention on. And so that's part of what we want to figure out as part of the vision. Okay, so just three big questions we'll ask Sophie today, and then I'll pass this on to our moderator to take it forward. I think the first is 10 years after the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, what has Wales learned? I feel like Wales is a leader for the world in basically figuring out what's the Future Generations Declaration and the framework around it and its implementation can be. So I think just trying to figure out like what are the lessons learned and how can we, for those of us who are trying to start, what can we learn and what can we do differently? I think the second is also quite important for us because our state has gone through a lot of like political turmoil and quite a bit of infighting. I think the question is how has Wales been able to insulate its long-term governance framework from political disruption? Because I think that's something we suffer a bit and also suffer across Africa as well. So I think it'd be cool to hear Sophie's thoughts because before Sophie's life as a Future Generations Commissioner, she's also been a politician as well from the local level all the way to the national level. So it's really cool to hear her insights and thoughts. I think the final question is how do we also position the vision so that it becomes a rallying point for the elections? We're quite lucky that we're launching the vision at the time when the state is going to the polls. We'll be voting next year. And so we're wondering how we can use this as a way to rally citizens to begin to hold more issue-based conversations around the elections and show that we shape what eventually becomes the leadership and the elections. Okay, so meet our guests. So just a short bio of Sophie. It's a very summarized version, like I said, of Sophie's bio, and then I'll pass this on to Chiwendun Blossom, our moderator. So between 2016 and 2023, Sophie was the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, the only role of its kind in the world. She held the government to account on how their decisions affect future generations, influencing major policy reforms across Wales. She has also been a significant voice in other countries, e.g. like Nigeria as well, following suit, including the UN, including the United Nations, who passed the world's first declaration on future generations in September 2024. She now advises other countries and corporates on implementing long-term governance. She's the future governance advisor at the School of International Futures, a global ambassador for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and holds a number of other board and academic advisory roles on human and planetary well-being. She's named as one of the UK's top 100 changemakers and at number 5 in the BBC's Women's Power list. She's not afraid to call out the madness of short-term decision-making and is known for being a straight-talking and inspirational advocate for those who are yet unborn. And so without further ado, I'll pass this on to Blossom, our moderator, to carry on the conversation with Sophie. Thank you so much for your time, Sophie. We're so grateful.
Thank you so much, Iben, and thank you so much, Sophie, for joining us. Welcome, everyone. My name is Blossom, as Iben has said, and I will be your moderator for today. We also have Bira here, who will be our rapporteur. So Bira will be taking notes in the background. We're looking forward to having a very interesting conversation today, and we're so excited to have you here, Sophie. I'm particularly excited. So I'll just go straight into the questions. So first of all, we want to know more about you, Sophie. Tell us about the arc of your career. So you moved from local councillor and then special advisor to 2 first ministers to becoming the first Future Generations Commissioner in the world. What drew you to this work, and what does stepping into a role that has never existed anywhere else before feel like? Sorry, Sophie, you're on mute.
Great question. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So what drew me to this and sort of what's my background? Well, I grew up in a part of Cardiff, which is the capital city of Wales, which was often in the headlines for the wrong reasons. So high levels of poverty and deprivation, high levels of worklessness, poor health outcomes, high levels of teenage pregnancy, all of those sorts of things, high levels of crime. And but actually, both of my parents worked, and by virtue of the fact that they worked, I actually went to school in a different part of Cardiff, which was a far more affluent part of Cardiff. And what has always stuck with me is the difference between the kids in school that I used to play with in school and the kids that I used to play with on the street at home, and their levels of aspiration, access to resources, the different, clubs and educational activities that they could get involved in, and so on, vastly different. And I suppose what I've always taken with me is, why is it by virtue of where you're born your life chances should be determined. And then increasingly, I suppose, as I've gone through my career, why is it by virtue of when you're born that your life chances should be determined? And that's very much what we're talking about in terms of future generations. So we know that this generation of young people are in many cases the first generation who will fare worse than their parents. So things have generally been getting better, not fast enough, but generally been getting better. But for many young people now, the threats, to the planet around climate change and biodiversity loss, the rapidly changing nature of work and whether our education system is keeping up, and even in global minority countries, even things like the increasing health outcomes are starting to kind of plateau. And so that brings me back to the sort of second reason why I'm in terms of what I'm passionate about. So I decided very early on that if I wanted to change things, I should try and get involved. My dad was a trade unionist and a political activist. One of my earliest memories was marching through the streets of Cardiff on a right to work march with a banner that was, I think, bigger than me. And so I had that sort of built into my psyche. And so I believed in politics, and I believed in politics and the power of politics to change things. So I decided that when we were first to get a parliament in Wales, so we'd previously in 1999 we'd had a parliament in the UK, but not in the regions, and we voted in 1999 for to have a Welsh Parliament and government. And I thought that this was the time really that they needed a different type of politician. So I stood for election at a local level at that time, not really thinking that I would get selected, let alone elected. And I did my degree at the same time, and also found out that I was pregnant at the same time. So I stood for election, did my degree at 6 months pregnant, had my first son, who's now 26, just a couple of months after I was elected. But what I very quickly saw is the aspirations that I had about how do we take those kids, in the areas like I grew up, and made sure that they all have the same level of access and resources and so on, that the system was fundamentally stacked against them being able to do that. So the system was short term. We only ever dealt with anything when a problem or a crisis had emerged. It was really disconnected from citizens. So what citizens might want or need or understand about how issues could be solved, we generally never spoke to them about that. And those two things have been a common thread throughout my career, from time I spent in policing to time I spent in government to being the first Future Generations Commissioner. How can we make sure that nobody is left behind, no matter where or when they're born? And how can we make sure that our systems of governance are doing better for people? And we need some fundamental changes to ensure that that is the case.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I completely agree. I think that sort of long-term thinking is what we need to put at the heart of governance today. And just like you mentioned in 1999, that just flows very well into our next question, which is, since 1999, Wales has placed sustainable development at the heart of governance through the devolution settlement and built on it for over 15 years before the 2015 Act. So what was the original insight that made Wales commit to legislating for future generations? And why was it a binding law as opposed to a policy or a strategy?
Yeah, another great question. So you're absolutely right. When the Welsh Parliament government were established, there was a clause in the Government of Wales Act which said sustainable development should be a central organising principle of the government. So that's good. That's a great clause to have. But what we find, and we see this across the world, there are lots of constitutions that have got reference to future generations or sustainable development or well-being of people and planet and so on. But they're generally vague lines in constitutions and so on. And when you dig a bit deeper, they often, half the time, politicians don't even know that they exist. Citizens don't necessarily know that they exist. And definitely the system is not operating in that way. So although we had this clause in the Government of Wales Act, there wasn't enough meat on the bones in terms of what does that actually mean in terms of what we should be doing. And there was a growing frustration in some parts of government, small parts of government, a small number of politicians, but critically outside also in civil society, saying, well, you've got this requirement in law, But our carbon emissions are still going up. We've still got huge rates of child poverty. We've still got an education system which isn't equipping young people for the future. We've still got all these problems. So we can't say that we are, genuinely implementing that principle. So civil society organised and said, we need to do better here. And they found their political champions who were just as frustrated. There was one political champion in particular, Jane Davidson. She was the environment minister at the time. And she was just as frustrated that, she couldn't get buy-in from the economy minister or from the transport minister. It was kind of seen as, oh, sustainable development, that's your thing. Sorry about the dogs barking in the background, if you can hear them. Sustainable development, that's your thing, when actually she was saying, I need you to be acting in this manner too. And that really led to her and civil society coming together over a number of years she was almost saying, you should critique what we're doing. You should challenge us to do better. And that's quite an unusual relationship sometimes between politicians and civil society, but it's an essential relationship. She established a non-statutory Sustainable Development Commissioner to report on the government's progress, how well they were doing. And she was building this over time. She was also building a really great core of civil servants in the government who could see that they weren't meeting these aspirations and that they needed to do better. Now, this bobbed along for a little while, pressure coming into the system and so on. And then what happened, which is what we see happen in very many countries, is there was a political moment. So something happens that suddenly this idea that has been kind of lying around, suddenly its moment comes. And for us in Wales, that moment was that there'd been a Labour government in the UK and a Labour government in Wales, but in 2010 a Conservative and Liberal Democrat government got elected in Westminster, and one of the first things that they did was to abolish the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK. And if there's one thing to know about Wales, it's that we like to do whatever it is that's the opposite of England. So there's some quite healthy competition there. And in this case, it was really healthy competition because that enabled this minister and civil society to say, look what they've done over there. Isn't that terrible? Not only should we not do that, we should go further and put this on a statutory footing. And that's what happened. She managed to get an election commitment from the then government to, with one line, we will legislate for sustainable development. The idea is that we would put more meat on the bones of what that clause in the Government of Wales Act meant. Now, that was brilliant. We got that commitment. She retired from government at that next election. So the new government were left with this thing that they'd committed to do, which had been her baby. She'd been the champion for it. And then they were like, oh, right, what have we signed up to do in here? We're going to have to do something because we promised in the election that we would do it. Now, at that point, it could have fallen flat. It could have failed because it had lost its political champion. But she had built they'd been building from the outside in civil society to keep the pressure up. They'd been building from the inside in the system amongst civil servants and so on, who were actually saying, we can do something we can make it happen. And so instead, the government said, well, okay, we don't know exactly what this is going to be. So what we should do is we should ask the citizens of Wales. We should have a national conversation which poses the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren and future generations to come? And we held that national conversation a bit like you've done in River State, engaging thousands and thousands of people in different ways across Wales, from town hall meetings to online platforms, to sectoral roundtables, to school children writing letters to their future selves, to youth board participation, a whole range of different things. And what the people of Wales said, they came up with about 12 principles, which were then taken back into the Senedd, the National Parliament, and turned into 7 wellbeing goals with a clear line of sight in terms of what the people of Wales had said, but also what was going on globally. So at the time, the Sustainable Development Goals were being drafted. So we were looking, what do the people of Wales say? What are our global obligations, and how do we, have a clear line of sight between those things? And that has been incredibly powerful, because it means that sometimes the SDGs can be a bit remote and people think, well, what do they mean to me, and so on. Maybe that's one of the reasons why delivery of the SDGs isn't as good as it needs to be. But actually, these goals came from the people of Wales. And the other powerful thing about it is that it then gives a political mandate to politicians to say, we need to act in line with achieving these goals because this is what the people of Wales have said. So that's how the legislation came about. And we see from my work in a range of other countries that the hard graft that you were doing in River State with the visioning exercise, sometimes it might feel like, oh, it's, nobody's taking any notice, or it's really difficult to get politicians on board, or, but that hard graft is absolutely essential to do to be ready to seize a political moment, which undoubtedly will come.
Thank you so much, Sophie. We really appreciate that. I think I can speak for the team when we say that. That gives us so much joy. So, so it's the next question. So, as you've mentioned, the Act sets 7 well-being goals and 5 ways of working: long-term thinking, prevention, integration, collaboration, and involvement. So, of these, which proved the hardest to embed in the day-to-day decisions of public bodies? And how did you move it from paper to practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, there were a few challenges with the goals. So the goals cover, the first goal is the goal of a prosperous Wales, which talks about a productive, innovative, low carbon society. It talks about a society that uses resources efficiently and proportionately and acts on climate change. It's essentially, if you like, the economy goal, but it makes no reference to increases in GDP. It says we're actually talking about prosperity for people and planet in Wales, rather than growth in the economy for growth in the economy's sake. Growth in the economy is a means to an end, not the end itself. The second goal is about a resilient Wales, and that's about enhancing, maintaining, restoring nature and ecosystems. And there, some of the challenges we had with that goal is people misinterpreting it. So a lot of people were just looking at the titles of the goals and making up the rest of it themselves. So, prosperity, obviously we're talking about increasing GDP. And one of my roles was to constantly be saying, no, that's not what the goal says. You need to go back to the legal definition of what that goal is. And that was a huge factor in terms of shifting mindsets, because generally across the world, when we talk about prosperity, it's about increasing GDP. When we talk about resilience, we could be talking about human resilience, mental health resilience. I can remember going into the Welsh Government office at the beginning of my appointment, and they had big pictures all throughout the main foyer in the Welsh Government buildings representing each one of the wellbeing goals. And the one that they had for resilience had police and ambulance, a picture of the police and ambulance on there, because they were talking about local emergency resilience forum. So even the people who'd done this in government didn't quite understand what it was that we were talking about. So a lot of what we had to do was explain again and again and again what these goals actually meant. That was the first challenge. The second challenge was that we needed to make sure that everyone understood that all of the goals apply to all of the public bodies. So the duty was each public body in Wales, from the government down to our municipalities, all our main institutions and so on, must set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of the wellbeing goals. Now, that was hugely powerful, because essentially what that means is every one of those institutions, every department or ministry of government must work beyond and understand the connections beyond what they are mainly responsible for doing. Now, that's really important, because if you think about it, if you think about health, if your starting point is health, and our national healthcare system is brilliant and it does, brilliant things, mainly treating people when they're ill. It helps people, it doesn't do an awful lot in terms of preventing illness in the first place. Now, preventing illness in the first place, it's about poverty. It's about air pollution. It's about lifestyle choices, whether you choose to travel actively or whether you're going to be in your car every day contributing to air pollution, and so on. So actually, the things that need to happen to improve people's health can't just be situated in the Ministry of Health and in our healthcare institutions. The flip of that is that if you took the healthcare sector if you took the healthcare sector across the world and imagined it was a country, it would be the fifth biggest emitter of carbon globally. So in what the healthcare system does, there's a huge amount of wasted planetary resources. There's a huge amount of carbon emissions. And yet climate change is one of the biggest threats to human health, as obviously as well as planetary health. So that requirement on all of those institutions to think beyond their traditional boundaries, hugely important, but hugely challenging, because again, our systems are designed for them all to work in silos and not talk to each other and do something over there without understanding the implications over there. So I would say those were the two most challenging things, that shift in mindset, what do we mean by these goals, and the joint working, and then the thinking to the long term. And I come back to the 5 ways of working then, the 5 principles in the legislation. Again, our system is stacked against thinking and acting for the long term. So it's mostly geared around responding to problems that we've already got. And it's almost like a vicious cycle, because the more effort and time we spend dealing with crises, the less time and space and resources we've got to think to the long term. And then you get 10 years down the line and you're in more problems and different type of problems that probably could have been avoided if we thought about it and applied foresight previously. So again, the challenges were finding that both headspace, for busy people in public services and in public policy to think and do things in a different way. Finding resource capacity. Health, again, is a really good example. How do we shift to preventative health when we're trying to meet the constant demand of an aging population, of more poor health, of long-term health conditions, and so on. And in that way, also shifting from shifting from just spending on acute to prevention. So when I talk about, I can talk about a lot of the problems, but we were working to try and find solutions, and there is no one silver bullet for any of this. What I would say is the key thing is that this was legislation that applied to everybody in Wales. There was some power behind it in terms of enforcement via the commissioner, but also the commissioner held a role of convening, bringing different people together, helping civil servants and others to apply foresight techniques, helping to think about, to think about the long term, helping to connect different departments and different sections of public policy together so that they could work through the implications. And so really the important thing was that whole system approach, rather than this just being a piece of legislation which still sits in the Sustainable Development Directorate and most people ignore. It was something that sat above all of that and placed these requirements on everyone.
Thank you, Sophie. That sounds very remarkable. So you've spoken about the first years being slow, with bodies using well-being words to describe business as usual. As the first commissioner, building the office from scratch, what were the biggest challenges and what ultimately made the role work and to give it teeth?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've described some of them in answer to the last question, but, I would also say that I'll come back to sort of the role of the commissioner. As I said, I held a role which was almost like a bit of a helicopter. I had a helicopter view over all public services and public policy in Wales and issues which were relevant both now and into the future. So a lot of the work that I did, I described the role of commissioner as both coach and referee. So coach in that I had powers to provide advice and support to the different public institutions. And many of them would clamour. We couldn't, my office was pretty well resourced compared to many, but we still couldn't meet the demand for people and departments in government to say, we're developing a new policy on planning or on transport or on whatever it might be. Can you help us think through what that would look like if we're properly applying the Future Generations Act? But where we did, work with those, institutions, and we couldn't work with them all, we saw fundamentally different things coming out from those policies and those initiatives. So far more foresight and long-termism, far more thinking through the lens of, if we do it like this, is that going to help or hinder us achieve all of the wellbeing goals? Is it going to mean that we do really well on one wellbeing goal, but do really badly on others? So creating a sort of safe space for governments and departments and ministries to sort of work through that was really, really crucial. I spent an inordinate amount of time introducing civil servants in one department of government to civil servants in another department of government. So, for example, the government had made an election commitment to build 20,000 affordable homes, which is great. Who doesn't like affordable homes? My role was to say, okay, over here in the skills department, they're developing a new skills strategy. And there's nothing in that skills strategy, as I can see at the moment, which says who's going to build the 20,000 affordable homes, because we've got a big gap there. And meanwhile, over here in the equity department, we have all these people who are very far removed from the labour market. We have a huge potential to get women into construction and, you know, underrepresented groups into construction. How are we bringing those things together? And then over here in the Environment Ministry, we have to meet carbon emissions targets. So we can't just build 20,000 affordable homes. They have to be 20,000 carbon neutral affordable homes. And so how are we going to do that? Now, it wasn't that all of those departments were like, you know, didn't care about that. It was just that they were in their silo, sort of going, right, I've got to build 20,000 affordable homes. That's the thing that I've got to do. When you open up their eyes and you start saying, okay, there's all these things that we need to think of and opportunities to build those homes, whilst also creating really brilliant jobs for those furthest from the labour market. And by putting that sort of positive spin on it, it can be really, really powerful, and you can actually win over hearts and minds in that way. And then the other thing that I would say is then also encourage them to apply foresight. So again, when we're building these homes, who are they going to be for? Because homes are going to be around for 50, 100, maybe, maybe 150, 200 years. So we have to make sure that they're going to be fit for purpose. So we know we've got an aging population. What types of homes are an aging population going to need? What are communities going to need to look like? Planning all of that in, once you create the space to open up people's minds to that and bring the different actors to the table, is really powerful. Very briefly, just on to the referee part of the role. So I had powers to intervene in decisions. I couldn't stop anyone doing anything or force anyone to do anything. But essentially, I had what I would describe as name and shame powers. So I could go into an institution or a collection of institutions. They had to cooperate with me in terms of providing me with information and so on. I could review decisions they had taken or were about to take, and then make recommendations if I felt that they weren't following the Future Generations Act. And then they had to publicly respond to those recommendations. And if they weren't going to follow my recommendations, they had to explain why publicly. Now, the first big test of that was that the government had plans to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity building a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion on one of our major motorways. And this will be something that every developing urban environment will be encountering. What do we do when there's a problem of congestion? We build more roads. Now, the problem with that is in building roads, we're using a huge amount of planetary resources. In building roads, we're going to fill them with cars, which is going to increase our carbon emissions. In building roads, we're discouraging people from travelling actively, and we're also taking investment away from public transport because we're using it to build a road. So I intervened in that and said, please explain to me how the Future Generations Act has been applied in terms of your decision to build a road. Can you explain to me how it's in line with the goal of a prosperous Wales? Let's go back to the definition: productive, innovative, low carbon society, one which uses resources efficiently, proportionally, and acts on climate change. Can you explain to me how it's in line with the goal of a resilient Wales? We need to maintain and enhance nature and biodiversity. The road was going through a nature reserve. Then can you explain to me how it's in line with the goal of a healthier Wales? Because we've got illegal levels of air pollution and we've got massively increasing rates of obesity. So explain to me why you think building a road is the best solution to meet that goal. And then also explain to me why you think the goal, building a road, is going to help with the goal of a more equal Wales, because 25% of the lowest income families in this region don't own a car. So are you saying you're going to spend the entire of the government's borrowing capacity on a project which helps only the already better off? Now, when you hold a mirror up to government and say, this is your law, this is what you passed, the goals within it are what citizens set. They're entirely sensible. Nobody disagrees with those goals. So now show me what you're going to do and how it's in line with those goals. Then they went, that's a bit tricky. So to cut a long story short, in practically every country in the world, when there's an argument between the economy versus the environment, because of course business was saying we need this road because our employees, our haulage vehicles, our whatever are stuck in congestion on this road. It's a fact. That is the case. But if we keep doing the same things, we can't expect different outcomes. So at some point we have to stop and say, we know, because the evidence tells us, if we build this road, it will be full again in 15 years' time. And we won't have invested that money in public transport. And air pollution will still be going up and carbon emissions will still be going up. So to cut a long story short, the government changed their minds. They cancelled the road building programme. They took the money that they were going to spend on that and they invested it instead in public transport. Now, I come back to the nub of your question here, which was like, what was difficult about that? There were many things that were difficult about that. All the vested interest in business and the economic arguments around building a road. I was not very popular. They wanted my head on a plate and said I should be abolished and, various other not very nice things. It's a good job I've got tough skin. The second point was, and this is a more sort of pertinent one, when you decide to do something different, so you don't spend the money on the road, you're going to spend that money instead in public transport. It doesn't mean in the next few months or even the next couple of years that suddenly you're going to have an amazing public transport system, which everyone can stop using the road and then go onto public transport. So this is the challenge. And whether, it's a road building scheme or whether it's how you think about how you invest in health, or whether there's always a lag between stopping doing something which everyone is used to, trying to do something better. Things take a while before they start getting better. Now, that road was cancelled in 2018. We're now in 2026, and it was the beginning of last year that the new metro system came online. And already in this first year, we've seen a fifth increase in passenger numbers. But during that time, the intervening period where we're, making these changes, it's very difficult. So it takes political bravery. It takes those who are, responsible for developing and implementing the vision. It takes bravery and courage from them and from civil society to say, actually, these are the right steps towards a vision. And, that's a challenge.
Wow, thank you so much. I really like how you've outlined how you protected the vision of this plan using government accountability. And one of the other next questions we're going to ask is about protecting the vision and foresight of this framework. So in Nigeria and in Rivers State, toxic and unpredictable politics has been a major barrier in planning, in long-term planning across Nigeria and states. So how did Wales protect the vision and foresight framework from electoral cycles, so that these goals remain supreme regardless of who is in power? How are you able to navigate that?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's not we don't have a perfect solution, but I haven't found anyone yet who's got a better solution. If anyone has, please shout, and I'm really up for looking at it. So I'll tell you how it works. The goals are set to be enduring. They're set for a generation. Now, there are some problems with that because, who's to say that, in 25 years' time, people will think they're the right goals or what have you. But I still believe that it's better to have a set of citizen created long-term goals, which become that North Star, that vision by which you're testing all of your policies. So the goals are embedded in law. They do not change from one electoral cycle to the next. What does change is that within a year from each election, the government and then the same process for local government as well have to set out their wellbeing objectives. Now, as I said, these in law they have to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of the wellbeing goals, and they have to be scrutinised by the commissioner. So they have to say, we are going to do these things, and this is why we think they are the best things to do to achieve these goals. Now, it's important that they get an opportunity to do that. Number one, because I'm not democratically elected. I was publicly appointed. There does need to be that accountability back to democratic institutions. The second point is, things change. So when the first set of goals were set in 2016, 17, we didn't know that COVID was going to happen in 2020. Now, the next set of goals that were set after the 2021 election, obviously, or it's not set of goals, sorry, set of objectives. The things that we needed to do were quite different because of post-COVID and so on, were quite different than the way we would have taken that forward in 2016. So you need to be able to have that sort of flexibility. What doesn't change, however, is the North Star. And I often describe this a bit like, someone gave me this analogy and I thought, well, that's it. She's described it really well when I was telling her about it. She said, it's like Google Maps. If you're trying to go somewhere, you put in an address in Google Maps, right? And Google Maps will give you maybe 3 or 4 different routes. It will tell you, there's a landslide there, or there's traffic and congestion there, or a quicker route is going to be on public transport, or, maybe you need to go and pick up your auntie from somewhere else on the way to take her shopping and do a good deed, and then you're going to get there a bit slower. Ultimately, however, you're going to get to where you're going. Google Maps is going to help you to get to where you're going. The problem with most countries is that they have no idea where they're going. Now, with us, we know where we're going. There might be diversions along the way. We might decide that we're going to take the more scenic route because it's a better way of getting there. Sometimes ideally you don't do this. We might go backwards before we start going forwards. But ultimately, you're going to get there. And that's the power of having the long-term wellbeing goals. And that's the power of also applying foresight. So the foresight part is, do I know if there's a landslide ahead? Do I know if there's going to be congestion? Do I know if there's going to be this, that, and the other? And a lot of that stuff in public policy making is actually applying that. Now, I know that climate change is coming and that we need to adapt and we need to do these different things. So for goodness sake, you wouldn't drive a car into a landslide. Why are you driving a population into a poorly adapted world for climate change? It would be craziness. That's the sort of mentality that we need to shift to.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Again, very remarkable. So this next question is focused on citizen participation. So this project, Rivers 2050, is citizen-led, and we believe that foresight belongs to the people, not just the government. So how did Wales involve citizens, including young people especially, and those not yet born, in shaping and holding the act to account? What can a citizen-led process like ours learn from what you've done?
Yeah. So, as I said, we held this national conversation. It was done back in 2014. So a long time ago now. We would probably do it differently now. We didn't have the same challenges then with mis and disinformation, with quite a polarized, or big risks around polarization and so on. But things that I think we would do in the same way was very much kind of community conversations. So we used what we called a sort of hub and spoke model. So there was one central organisation. It was not run by the government itself, and that was really powerful. Now, there were 2 interesting things about that. One, I think if it had been a government-run consultation, people feel, are the government going to do anything about it? There's these issues of kind of mistrust and so on and so on. Maybe not as many people would have engaged, etc., etc. And I think it would risk becoming more polarized, more political, and so on. I suppose the risk for the government was exactly the same. If it all went wrong and, you know, and it became a sort of disaster, actually, by them not running it and giving it to a kind of civil society organisation, they could remove themselves a little bit from that. So that's, I suppose, the insider like politicking, I suppose, that went on behind it. But in terms of the way that it was done, the central organising institution that was funded by the government to do it, they worked with a whole big network of different institutions. So they worked with the Young Farmers Association, who then held local conversations in all of their membership groups across the country. They worked with the Women's Institute, who did the same. They worked with particular local community councils who held their own conversations, the Llanelli we want, or the Swansea we want, or what have you. And all of that information was coming back in. They held roundtables by sectors, you know, with business, with NGOs, with the health sector, with a range of different sectors. They held big conferences, bringing insights from all of those different conversations together for people to almost thrash out where are the intersections, where are the conflicts, all of those sorts of things. They did innovative things using arts and cultural, you know, poetry and music. We had Michael Sheen. I don't know if any of you know Michael Sheen, but he's a famous Welsh actor who, I mean, personally, I would really like Michael Sheen to be the First Minister of Wales, but that's another matter. He is a brilliant social. He's just embedded in doing social good in Wales, but he's also a Hollywood superstar. So he was a face of the Wales we want, and that was really great as well. And we used a lot of people like that. So that's how we went about doing it. As I said, we might do it differently now. One of the things that we didn't do, and we would probably do better, is we didn't do so much of the like foresight piece with citizens. But it was quite interesting. So, you know, we didn't tell them, okay, these are the projections or the potential scenarios for 2050. These are in this area, or these are things that could happen. But you know what? Citizens knew those things themselves. They were coming up with all of that themselves. They didn't need a kind of foresight exercise to do it. And sometimes they were talking back to the past. They were saying things like, in the fields where I used to play when I was a kid, there's a petrol station there now, and you know, and my grandkids have got asthma, and there's this and this and this. And so, whilst they were coming out with those very specific things, the way in which we were questioning, well, what does that mean? What would you like to see different? What does that mean in terms of, like, you know, how should we have done things differently, and how would they look differently if we were, you know, if you had your ideal future? And that was kind of really powerful too. Oh, can I just say something about young people?
Yeah, yes, please.
So lots of different ways of engaging young people in the process. But since the involvement principle does not end there, so 5 principles in the legislation: plan for the long term, prevent problems from occurring or getting worse, join the dots between your actions, work together, and involve citizens. So that involvement principle is an ongoing statutory duty in our legislation. And some of the things that have come out particularly for young people, this happened before the legislation, but every school has to, by law, has to have both a school council and an eco council, and there are mechanisms then to draw the views of children and young people. I work very closely with the Children's Commissioner, who does a survey every few years with tens of thousands of young people, and we draw that insight in. We have lowered the voting age to 16 in Wales, and we have a youth parliament. That came really from those involvement principles and the, you know, movement growing. I established something called a Future Leaders Academy, which was a cohort of 30 young leaders every year doing across a range of different sectors, working on future generations policies in their sectors. But my favourite part of it was we also ran, as part of that, a reverse mentoring scheme. So those young leaders, we paired them with the 30 most senior leaders in Wales for those young leaders to mentor the existing old leaders. And it was fascinating. I mean, number one, some of the older leaders getting their head around the fact that it was young people teaching them stuff, not the other way around. That, for some of them, they struggled. But also there were some amazing things that came out of that. So Sam, who was one of our young mentors, reverse mentored the chief executive of the Football Association of Wales. And from that came the chief exec decided there's so much that football could do to contribute to these 7 wellbeing goals. We're going to frame our entire strategy around delivering the 7 wellbeing goals with an aspiration to be the most sustainable football association in the world. Now, they're working towards that. I was just with them this week. They've just won sustainability awards. They've just run the under-20s UEFA tournament in Wales, and that was the most sustainable tournament that UEFA have ever run. So there are wins that are powered by young people, and that's why it's so critically important to involve them.
Wow. I'm so excited to hear this like pioneer projects that young people are leading. So crucial and so important. So as the next step after the vision book is launched, we plan to advocate for the River State Future Generations Bill, which is modeled on the Welsh and Australian examples. So knowing what you know now, what would you tell a region drafting such legislation today? What would you insist on, and what mistakes would you advise to avoid?
In terms of the drafting of our legislation, I think it's pretty comprehensive. I haven't seen any other legislation which provides a more comprehensive framework. The trick, however, is in the implementation. So there's something around, first off, the powers of the commissioner. And it's a difficult one because, as I said, on the one hand, should the commissioner be able to force organisations to do something if that commissioner is not democratically kind of elected or doesn't have that democratic mandate? Some people may say that the challenges of our time actually say that yes, maybe they should. Other people say no, that's taking it too far. I think I would like to see the powers of the commissioner maybe to take organisations through a court process, especially set out court process, to determine some of these issues. I think that could be really powerful. There is a critical thing, I would say, about building into your legislation the goals, the vision, the ways of working, but then we had in our regulations attached to the legislation what we call the corporate areas for change. So this is where the legislation should specifically apply. And it basically permeated all aspects of what a public body would do. So it included financial planning, so how, budgeting, basically. It included procurement, how you're spending your money on goods and services. It included workforce planning, asset management. How are we managing the assets which are government run, which are, ginormous? How are we considering risk management and so on? So there's something there about really thinking, because otherwise you get policy people maybe taking it on board. And then over here, you've got procurement professionals who are going, well, actually, we just want the lowest price. No, that's not it, because we need to harness. We were spending £6 billion a year in Wales procuring goods and services. That £6 billion a year needs to be working to deliver those 7 wellbeing goals. So there are some nuances there, which I would suggest that you kind of look at, and then really look at the kind of, commissioners' powers. The final thing that I would say, if I had to leave you with sort of, 2 words that would summarize that, it would be everybody. And when I mean everybody, I mean everybody, citizens, NGOs, in terms of feeling that they have ownership and they are participating in this. But I would also, everybody, as in every public body, must be covered by the legislation. It can't just sit in government and then the government sort of sends, instructions down. It has to be a duty on everybody. And then everything. So every way in which they spend money, manage their assets, think about risk, do their corporate planning, do their workforce planning, all of those things. It has to permeate all of that, because that's what adds up to a whole system approach. And that's what you need to have this legislation doing for you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So many gems from that. So at this point, we're going to pause for questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat, and I'll gladly read it out. Let's see. Any questions, comments, reflections, thoughts, anything interesting you'd like to add?
Rachel had jumped off, but she left the comments thanking Sophie for the thoughts.
Great. Okay.
Well, I'm more than happy to come and chat again if you think of questions. I'm really excited to be working with to make connections with Eben before this, to hear the wonderful work that you're doing. With the School of International Futures, we are super keen to support that work, and I think I might have some good news for you on that soon, Eben. So I will be in touch very soon. And we're really keen to look at, how we might be able to work with you to establish a long-term governance hub, how we can connect you to other parts of Africa and indeed the world that are doing interesting things in this space, and to support you in any way that we can. So when any questions that you've got going forward, just send them my way, and we're going to be speaking regularly, I imagine.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Appreciate that so much. Okay, so in the absence of questions, we will just ask you one final question. And this is a question that we ask every guest that we've had who comes on the platform to discuss their ideas. So with what you have learned about Rivers State and what you have witnessed in Wales, what you have seen Wales achieve as a small nation that chose to think in generations and infuse long-term thinking into its governance, where do you imagine Rivers State can get to over the next 25 years if we get our foresight and implementation right?
Well, I mean, I think I am no expert on River State, but from what I know about River State and about the power of applying long-term thinking and the assets that you have in River State at the moment, I think you've got the potential to become one of Africa's leading centres for the future, for a new type of economy. In particular. And I think that in order to do that, that will require investment in skills and education. It will require diversification away from oil, and targeting and directing those skills towards new industries. Of course, you are a majority young population, and that has huge potential if you seize that moment to invest in that younger population to be doing completely different things. The worst thing that could happen is that investment isn't made in that kind of human capital and investing in new industries. And when you as younger people age, there is not the population coming behind you who have the skills to keep you and government services and so on afloat. But at the moment, you have a huge opportunity there. So I would say, do not copy what we've done in the UK, and definitely do not copy what they've done in America. Forge your own path here with the brilliant young minds that you've got. And yesterday, quite by chance, I actually had dinner with some young people from schools in Abuja and Lagos, who are doing some amazing things. They've come on exchange to Wales, which I was thrilled about. And I was blown away by one of the young girls, Amibola, who was doing, she'd won an award for doing work on period poverty in her school, and has transformed, everything from the number of days that girls are in school, because now they feel able to come to school during menstruation, and, various other things. Now, that is one girl in one school who is probably, there's 600 girls in that school. And she will be transforming, potentially in her small way, educational opportunities for those 600 girls. Now, if everyone was doing that, and if the system of governance and government and politics actually facilitated you all to be able to do that, that is hugely powerful in terms of the assets and the resources that you've got. So never think you're too small, and never accept a system that is fundamentally broken. Challenge it and change it.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Words of marble. Okay, so I can see there's a hand up, and we do have a question. Yes, please go ahead and ask the question.
Bazia, hi Bazia, lovely to see you.
Greetings, likewise,
We're all
likewise.
friends.
Sophie has been spearheading and providing us with her leadership and expertise and mentorship for such a long time. I thought it would be completely dishonest not to have supported Sophie and Eben. My question is actually about a product made in Wales, SenseMaker, Dave
Oh yeah,
Snowden, and his
yeah.
efforts in using stories
Uh-huh.
to obviously collect stories from the citizens, advance democracy. So, what is the role of storytelling, collecting stories, and
Yeah.
expanding these stories in the line of efforts? Thank you. Over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know SenseMaker and Dave well. And we actually used it at the beginning of my term. We used SenseMaker to build the sort of second national conversation, because I wanted to pose the question, okay, we've set these wellbeing goals. I then wanted to have a national conversation about what are the policy areas, if we got them right, would make the biggest contribution to meeting those wellbeing goals. Because those, I had to prioritize what I did as commissioner, and SenseMaker helped, and the stories helped me to prioritize that. And then we were using SenseMaker as well. We actually used it with citizens, employing like citizen journalists and various other things. We did some brilliant work with an organisation called Democracy Box, which is specifically focused on kind of young people, setting up talking shops across to gather people's stories and so on. But we also use SenseMaker with our public institutions. So when I first brought them all together in a conference, we used SenseMaker to really pinpoint like where their sticking points were. So I think it has multiple uses. And the power of it is those nuggets that come out of stories that don't necessarily come out of data or audit reports or any of those things. It's those nuggets of like, information. This is the thing that's blocking. This is the thing that's helped me unblock. And you will find there's lots, once you do those sorts of exercises, you will find there are lots of like similarities across there. So you're able to hone and pinpoint where you go. But yeah, it's a powerful tool.
Thank you very much. I guess the next generation of public opinion surveys, the only difference being a lot more participatory, and very glad to hear the wonderful history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Sophie, as well, for giving us your time. This was a fantastic conversation, and I'm really excited. And thank you. We'll wait for our political moment to come. And while we look forward to that, I will hand over to Eben for closing reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Blossom, for moderating this so beautifully. And thanks a lot, Sophie. It's so much fun listening to you and just like hearing about the amazing work that you've done. And thanks everyone. Thanks Basir and everyone who joined in from the NGFP network and from the task force. So all of the insights from today, obviously, will go into the book as well. And Sophie, you'll be one of the first people definitely to get a draft copy, just in case you have any thoughts or insights on areas that we may be missing out. That will be sometime in August. Work has been going on since last year, putting together the vision, and now we're beginning to just bring the data together. For those who also are not aware, so we have a project website where information from today's session will be, but all the information from all the sessions we've done, I think now 26 plus sessions that we've had as part of our public consultations, all that data is on our website and also on YouTube. So you can check that out as well, rivers2050.org and youtube.com/@policy shapers. And final announcements. So we have two last focus groups before we're done. So on the 18th, we'll be having a focus group discussion on peace and security, bringing together some community peace building and security outfits and leaders to come discuss. So like what could be the future of security and peace building from a community lens for the state, because it's again possible to build all of this infrastructure and have it destroyed by conflict. So how are we more proactive in avoiding conflict and addressing conflicts earlier, looking at the early warning signs and stuff like that. And then we're also going to have the final conversation on agriculture and food security. This is quite key because despite being blessed with 11,000 square kilometers of land, we're not food secure. And this is not a good thing. So I think that agriculture is a huge potential for us as a state, and it's something that we are really keen on addressing. We're currently working out the times and matching the calendars for the various speakers. But once we do, we'll be able to bring that to you as well. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks, folks. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks, Sophie. Have a great rest of your evening, everyone. And we'll have the recording on our YouTube. Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.